War of Wanderers. Chapter 1, Rook. The bright yellow scorching sun flooded the sky across the empty desert plains. Each passing moment drew the dry air further into the lungs for his horse. While Quentin wanted to stop and let his steed rest, he couldn't. When one is searching for something, it's not uncommon to feel like you're being searched for yourself. He pressed on through the rough dune sea. No sign of shade in miles, except for a small outcropping of what looked to be a tower. This tower stretching out like a beacon, similar to a lighthouse but not as radiant. It looked to be empty from the outside as the few windows adorned along the side were pitch black except for the sun rays which still obfuscated Quentin's view. He could feel that his horse was getting tired and knew it likely wouldn't survive a trip back without much needed rest. Once the full height of the tower was no longer obstructed by dunes, he put the map back into his backpack. Rolling it up carefully as he bounced on the trotting horse which was slowing down. Just because it wasn't his horse didn't mean he failed to recognize the work he had put it through. Not many horses would have the stamina to push across the Angalna desert. Once they reached the base of the tower, Quentin promptly dismounted. He reached into his pack and cupped one of his hands, the other poured water carefully. He would do this several times for the next 10 minutes as he allowed the horse to drink, being careful not to let any spill on the starving desert floor. Upon seeing the horse was satisfied enough to stop its panting and wheezing from the long journey, he drank from his flask. The shade of the tower being a bigger respite than he had imagined. The sun was still high and he knew he had roughly half a day to hold out for. "Well, glad we made it, I told you we could do it." Quentin spoke softly to the horse. The horse said nothing as of course, it was a horse. But that didn't stop Quentin from patting the horse and taking off its saddle, once he had secured the horse by the reins to the tower as the wall of the tower wasn't flush. He dropped his backpack to the ground and knelt over it. He carefully dusted off his helm. It was similar to a crusader style with small slits for the eyes, and 2 sets of 6 smaller slits on each cheek. The helmet was painted with a solid green on the left side and white on the right. Quentin made sure to wrap and roll up his cloak that not only got him through the desert but also kept his tunic relatively clean. The tunic bore a simple green checkered pattern on his left chest and torso, while a matching pattern covered the right side of his legs. Quentin carefully drew his sword, wiping away the grains of sand that had snuck into his scabbard earlier. He stood now, leaning his ear to the door. Nothing came from inside. Taking one final look back at the horse, he covered himself with his helm. It made him feel safe even if other cultures might find this way of thinking odd. Before he pressed his hand on the door, he felt a cold breeze rush against the chain mail. His whole body felt great relief after having been under the sun's blaze. But it didn't make sense, the tower ought to be as hot as the dunes. For no windows were affixed to the tower, and the heat should be enveloping the tower as much as anything else out here. But he didn't give it too much thought as he had heard stories of people going mad thinking they had found an oasis. Perhaps this was happening to him. But of course, he trusted the map, and following it by using the sun and stars had brought him here just as it had said. After months of searching, his quest was at its end. Quentin gently cracked open the door of the tower, the air again feeling cool against his body. His face, which had been covered in sweat, didn't feel hot in his helm thanks to the breeze. Had he not been feeling chased, he likely wouldn't have kept his armor on, but he didn't want to be unprepared should an ambush ensue. However, he had also trusted that the desert would be tough to follow in, and making his crossing into the biome had surely discouraged anyone to pursue. Though this was just his theory, for the world was vast and strange, and he wouldn't be surprised if someone or something did manage to find him. Certainly, if nothing else, the tower was not making any attempts to hide itself. He knew it was hypocritical to think this way, as the tower's lack of obscurity aided in his own search. The door made a loud creaking sound as it was pushed open. The cool air now rushing out against Quentin as he pushed his way inside. He didn't want to get stuck, so before moving on he reached down and placed one of the many loose stones against the base of the door to keep it open. It also made for a quicker escape should he need it. The bright light from the desert sun seemed to fade almost instantly, as if God had turned off the lights inside or placed a barrier between the entrance of the tower and the sands. In fact, when Quentin tried to hear the stirring of his horse, it was silent. Immediately he ran back out of the tower, raising his sword up to bear. After exiting he heard the sounds of the horse return and the winds of the dunes calm his nerves. He was alone. The tower itself was not quite what he was expecting. Quentin was told he would be welcomed into the tower and that if he managed to find it, they would provide hospitality. Yet the tower appeared abandoned and empty. Just walking not even halfway up the first set of stairs he could see the cobwebs that gripped furiously to the walls. The steps looked as though someone thought gold was beneath them and had to chip the stones away with a pickaxe. He noticed that when he looked out of the first window it was also black. The light from the doorway shined through, illuminating the beginning of the tower, but not the rest. Quentin reached at the window and felt cloth. A deep black curtain had been hung that was flush with the window, almost as if to trick those outside into thinking the place was abandoned. He promptly tore it down and made his way upwards, the stairs circling around the central pillar. As he climbed, he tore down more curtains, leaving a trail of cloth along the steps. Once he finally got to the next door, which led to what he presumed was the top of the tower, or at least a room where he could rest, he took off his helm and pressed his ear to the door, this time hearing a crackling sound. He immediately thought it was fire, and Quentin quickly covered his face with his helm and burst through the door, keeping a tight grip on the handle of his sword. There was indeed a fire, but it was simply a torch that was almost going out. He knew someone had been here, but it had at least been a while since they were in this room. It's likely the tower was abandoned in a hurry. There were of course signs that made the room look like a struggle took place. He walked over to the table that boasted control of one's attention and he found several pieces of paper which had been strewn across it. Laying in the center of the table was a map of the surrounding lands. He would clearly see where he had come from, city of Galden east of here. To west lie the hills of Maroon, a name given to them for how they appear when cast in sunrise or sunset. Interestingly, the map didn't place the tower here. It wasn't on any part of the map. So whatever information he had received regarding this place did not come from the tower itself. Likely it was made by someone who might not have been inside the tower. Quentin's eyes were drawn to a particular paper which had a dried blood stain on it. After searching for many years, it would seem that I finally found this place. The Tower of Argust. I didn't know it could appear to me too close to my home. Perhaps it entered my mind through a dream. But I await what treasures it holds. It's my first time leaving home. I won't lie that I am worried about where this tower will take me. But I know that it has to be more exciting than here. Quentin stopped reading as his attention was caught by a much longer note than the tiny diary entry size of the first one. When he had been told of this place, he was meant to use it as a safe place to rest before continuing onward to find the city beneath the hills. Nobody had mentioned treasures of the sort. In fact, if there were treasures, he could tell they would be long gone now. He looked around the room, making sure nobody was watching him before reading the next note. Dear Marcia. It was come to my attention that rumors have once again been circling around about how we got our wealth so quickly. I heard whispers at the tavern that our riches were cursed by a dark force. I feel slightly inclined to believe them. We went to that tower only to better our own lives. It feels like we are being punished emotionally for our physical actions. It's driving me crazy. I know it was a secret between us, but I don't think this will stay that way. Because I don't know how to explain any of this. I still don't know where the wealth is coming from. You said I could reach out if I needed help. Hopefully this doesn't get intercepted by looters or thieves. Nobody should know about the tower. Heaton. Quentin didn't know what to think. How could he even have known that he might be standing in a place of pure evil? Just because nothing was threatening his body, didn't mean his mind wasn't under attack. There was only one thing he could do with this new knowledge: try to find whoever or whatever was making this place so evil. He got up and walked over to the next door. Again he took off his helm and listened to the door. He instantly backed up and drew his sword up again, ready to defend himself. What he had heard on the other side sounded like a faint moaning or grumbling. It sounded like someone muttering to themselves angrily but still trying to be quiet. Quentin was slightly worried that he had been heard due to his plate and chainmail clattering from when he had barged into the room. He did his best to deafen his breathing so as to maintain an element of surprise. The sword was slowly brought up to his waist, pointed directly at the door, ready for a quick stab. While he did have his shield on his back, which was also bearing the green checkered pattern in the same manner as his tunic, it would be too noisy to retrieve. So, with the entirety of his trust placed in his sword, after taking a slow breath, he pushed the door open forcefully, the door itself crashing into the wall on the left. The first thing Quentin saw as the door gave way was a creature of some sort. It was hunched over, facing away from him. It wore simple ragged pants and shirt, both a dark brown. Its head was covered in a rusty helm with its droopy ears sticking out. The creature wore no shoes and had long toes with unkempt toenails. As Quentin circled around the creature, he could see its long skinny fingers wrapped around a wooden totem of sorts. It appeared to be muttering under its breath, but its seeming unawareness of Quentin's presence was not believed in the slightest. Held steady, the sword slowly found its place beneath the creature's chin. This made the creature pause to look up at the Green Knight. Its eyes widened open as its mouth hung wide. A combination of brightly colored fangs and teeth stole most of the focus. As the creature rose up to avoid the sword, it stood a reasonable stature similar to Quentin. It looked to be a man who might be twisted into a monster due to unknown forces. "What are you doing here?" the creature grumbled deeply. "I'm looking for something my lord has requested, though I don't think it's in your possession. Perhaps we can go on our separate ways? I merely had to draw my blade against you for my safety, you understand? Do you understand?" Quentin stumbled through his explanation. The creature slowly placed the totem on the ground, revealing its nails to be more like claws which had extended in length. Its belly sagging as though this creature had just consumed its dinner. Slowly, with a single step, the creature approached, the tip of the blade against the creature's neck. "Look, I don't want any trouble, honest. I think I'll just go," Quentin stammered. "Ruble is had you got?" The creature started losing control of its words as it looked hungrily at Quentin. "Last chance. I'm serious," Quentin shouted to compensate for his fear. He had not killed anything in many years. "Come here, inner," the creature bellowed before making a dodge to its right. Quentin's sword leaped forward and staggered into the stab he had prepared. Seeing the creature move to lunge at him, he used his momentum to continue forward, making sure the creature's claws only clashed with the shield on his back. The creature was acting recklessly, as it had put so much effort into its leap that it rolled across the room after its claws smashed into the shield. Quentin turned to his right, facing the creature as he pulled his shield around his body, held tightly in his left hand. He once again raised the sword to a stabbing posture, but did so behind the frame of the shield. He didn't see much damage on the shield, thereby indicating that this creature was fast, but perhaps fragile. The creature stood again and faced Quentin. It raised its claws as it charged once again, snarling and growling as it moved. The creature was promptly met with the shield bashing against its body, sending the creature stumbling backwards before a loud screech could be heard. For the sword, hidden from view, had snapped out and made a vicious pierce into the creature's stomach, though it did not stay impaled. Instead, it withdrew and returned behind the shield again. Thick dark red blood covered the blade about 1/3 towards the hilt. The creature gasped and wheezed before collapsing to the ground, its entrails cushioning the fall. The creature lay motionless as Quentin slowly approached the body. He cautiously tapped its head with his sword. Nothing. It was then that he let out his first deep breath. In fact, Quentin wasn't sure how fast or slow he was breathing during the engagement. He tried to steady himself but felt his arms shaking as he looked for a cloth to clean his blade. Never in his life had he seen such a creature, not even sure what to call it. He had heard stories of monsters living in the mountains, but they never described a creature such as this. Had it not been for the ears and lanky posture, it could have passed as human. This thought terrified Quentin and motivated him to hurriedly wipe his blade on the tablecloth that was placed below the creature where it had been hunched over in the center of the room. Once the blade was cleaned and sheathed, he could make further inspection of this new room. The candles hanging on the wall illuminating the space were perfectly bright. Were it not for the cultish ritual, the room might be considered homely. The walls were covered with bookcases containing various novels, none of which particularly drew any interest to Quentin. He was much more focused on the book which lay before him on the ground. While the totem would be of interest, he wanted to first know what the creature was doing with it. He knelt down and swung the shield around to his back. Leaning over, he grabbed the book which had a title which most might consider unsuspecting, Orson. His eyes then drew towards the open page which had been exposed. Teleportation portal, spell. Ingredients. 1 totem from the bowels of the deep, 3 circles traced ever so neat, 2 tails of rat and cow, and 3 pints of blood to give out. Instructions. Draw 3 circles roughly the same size to ensure all circles cross into each other but not stacked. Then place the tails inside 2 of the 3 circles. Finally place the totem in the 3rd circle. If you did this correctly, the tails and totem would allow a new circle to be seen. In this circle, contribution of blood is needed from any and all parties wishing to benefit from the spell. Caution. Anyone trying to use the portal without having committed blood shall be crushed beyond comprehension until their blood is added to the center of the circle, similar to squeezing a lemon. Quentin didn't know what to think of this spell. It would seem that the creature was likely trying to use the spell to get out of the tower. The spell never mentions where this portal would take you and if you could return to it. He didn't want to take any risks of this being used in the wrong hands. So kept the book. He laid his shield on the ground for a moment. Then grabbed his pack, which at this point contained contents that were tossed about from avoiding the creature. He did his best to shift around the supplies enough to make room for the book. After making sure the pack could still be secured to his back, he then mounted his shield onto himself again, keeping the pack safe. The window in this room was also covered in a large curtain. Once again, he approached and drew back the shades. To his disappointment, it was pitch black once again. When he had approached the tower, there had only been 3 sets of windows. Having already found the second one, he knew what he was looking for had to be in the 3rd floor. This made Quentin excited as he placed his hand on his sword before leaning and listening against the door again. The metal of his helmet made noises quieter, but after what he had just dealt with, he didn't feel safe taking it off again. Again, no sound broke through into the chambers he was occupying. Slowly and gently, he pushed the door open with his foot, as it didn't have any handle like the first 2. Perhaps it wasn't meant to be secure. Or maybe it was only secured on the other side and someone had forgot to bar it shut. Upon the door creaking open, he saw a marble altar in the center. A fireplace behind it looked to have been used many years ago, as the room was surprisingly cold despite the tower being in a desert. The walls were again lined with bookshelves, though this time no creatures in sight. Quentin relaxed as he walked over to the altar. He leaned around and checked every inch of the room before the let his guard down. Just to be safe, he latched and secured the door where he had entered from using a large wooden brace. Quentin took off his helmet again and brushed his brown hair to the side as he stared at the altar. Just as had been predicted, a drawing of one of the oldest artifacts was chiseled in the stone. Quentin dropped his pack onto the floor and pulled out some heavy thick paper and pressed it against the indents of the stone. Once the indents were made, he used a match to scrape against the paper. The friction helped to cement all the details of the artifact into the page, creating a masterful black and white drawing of the artifact. Quentin had no idea what the artifact was or what it did. But he had been tasked to get it, and now that he knew what it looked like, the real journey could begin. He made sure to keep the paper flat as he slid it inside the spell book to keep it safe. He knew it was an obvious hiding spot, but it was all he could think of. Plus, it would mean he could more discreetly observe and work to memorize the drawing so as to at worst only been seen as a mage. While there was nothing wrong with being a mage in his eyes, it often was frowned upon in most cities. The further out you went, the more it was accepted. So being here in a lumbering tower in the middle of a desert where nobody can look through the windows was about as accepting a place as one could want. This likely explained why the creature was here, performing the ritual. Quentin didn't know if the creature brought the book in with it, or if the book originated in the tower. But he did know that the book would now be leaving with him. He quickly placed the book back into his pack, feeling relieved to have completed the first step in his quest. With his pack secured, shield covering his pack again, he drew his sword as he made his way out of the room. The stairway clunked as his plate armor crashed through the walls. The sound echoing much louder than before because Quentin was in such a hurry. While he doubted that anyone would dare to enter this tower, he still feared he was being hunted, though no evidence had supported his theory yet. At this moment his biggest fear would be if he got to the bottom and his steed was gone. Either ran away or struck dead, both terrified him. As he passed the body of the creature, he could see that it looked very dehydrated. As if time had caught up to it when it passed to the afterlife. While all things perish and join those in another plane of reality, some refuse to depart nicely. Suspicious of this creature, Quentin made sure to impale his sword into the creature's head, making sure he wouldn't have any surprises on the way down. Or worse, have it actually follow him back to the nearest town to rest. Before Quentin had arrived at the tower, he had been told that if he could bring a picture of the artifact to some future seer, they might be able to guide him. While it was rare to find an image of the artifact, it was considered impossible to find the object itself, though many have tried. It was said that the artifact gives one the power to rule as he wished, to bend lesser beings to their will, and allow the user to dominate all life as he knew it. Upon hearing the legends about the artifact, Quentin was of course skeptical and thought that such an object would never be lost, more likely hidden. As you wouldn't want to leave something like that unattended. Of course, the last time it was seen was back in the 6th age. Quentin made his way out of the tower, the bright rays of the sun blinding him as he had to readjust to the light. His armor lit up like a candle as his figure cast a shadow onto the wall of the tower. Its stone exterior looking just as awful as when he had entered. A big sigh of relief left his lungs upon seeing his horse was still there. It looked thirsty as ever, and Quentin rushed to pour more water into his hands, letting the horse drink slowly. The loud gulping sounds of the horse easing on the tension Quentin had been holding. He sheathed his sword once again, and took off his helmet as it was already making his forehead drenched in sweat. He strung his pack around the horse's neck to let it hang on the side. He kept his shield tightly against his back while making sure the sword sheath didn't press into the horse. He placed his helmet into his pack, particularly sticking out as he drew his cloak over himself to help with the sun. It also drew less attention than his branded white tunic. He leaned over and tugged forcefully on the reins to release the horse from the tower wall. The horse shook its head with joy, excited to leave as the tower had provided little protection. While the sun was no longer as high as it could be, it still colored the sands with a yellow tint all the same. Simply looking out across the dunes there was nothing in sight. While he felt that he had packed plenty of water, rationing it wouldn't be as easy. As thirst kept an iron grip clutched at his throat, he'd have to avoid any extra excursion, when possible. That's where the horse came in. I know I haven't named you yet, and I'm sorry it hasn't come to be. But in my time of need when you could have chomped at your reins you held still, held strong. Quentin looked up at the tower again and smiled. Rook, like this tower, that shall be your name. In honor of our first journey together, so we may never forget it." Quentin patted Rook along her mane as he turned her away from the tower. Before he could start to leave, he heard a rumbling behind him. Looking back at the tower, he watched as it shook violently before disappearing before his eyes. He couldn't explain it, and didn't believe it. As it disappeared, so did the sun, the sky. Before he could try and touch it, he watched as some sand blew through where it once stood. It left no trace imprinted on the sand from where it once stood, as if it was never really there. Quentin didn't want to believe everything he had just done had been a mirage. Now, breathing faster as he became increasingly frightened, he drove into his pack. He pushed aside his helmet and water to finally pause. The book was still there, and so was his drawing. It hadn't been for nothing, he didn't dream it or make it up. Quentin thought of himself as lucky for being one of the few to have seen the artifact and bring record of it to civilization once again. But he couldn't prove it. His only witness being Rook, he knew he'd have to keep this experience to himself or risk being viewed as another of the many storytellers who claim outlandish things, such as orcs brooding in the woods beyond the mountains, or fish that can walk on land along the coast of the Denari River. Two things nobody has ever seen. There were plenty of stories out there, and his was no different. The best he could do is bring what he found back to his lord to ensure he can prove his loyalty. What good is a knight without a kingdom to defend and uphold? He began to lead Rook away from the spot of his most recent adventure. They wandered for miles before the edge of the Koldar town was in sight. Even then, it would still be many more miles beyond that until actually reaching their destination. For no matter how brave a soul you are, their risk of maddening in the desert is an ever-constant threat. Some stories claim that the dead who are buried go on to serve the warriors whose blood was spilled. For back in the 6th Age it was said that the residents of Koldar could see figures roaming in the dunes. Their mere sight would trick people into leaving the safety of their homes to venture into the dry sea. Quentin chuckled to himself as he thought of those stories. It had not been since he was a child that he had even considered the old folklore he had been read. His mother was not someone who often liked to give hope to her children. A pig farmer must always keep his head in the mud, this was one of the famous things his mother would say. She didn't want anyone to abandon what her and those before her had built. Quentin's mind drifted as he rode through the desert, with Rook keeping a reasonable pace. He thought of the day when his father left. Though he had only been told later on what happened. Quentin didn't know what age this had occurred, but he knew he was young enough to remember what he was told, but not old enough to remember what he did. In his mind it went as follows. He had been leading one of the pigs back into the barn as it was getting too late for them to keep laying in the mud. No reason to risk the wolves getting at them. Each pig may as well have been family to Quentin, as he had always been conveniently unaware of the slaughter done by his parents and older brother. So, Quentin patted the pig goodbye, and skipped across the path back home. When he got home, it was here that he would quickly and forcefully find himself in his father's arms, pressed against his father's stomach. "Don't look over there, son. Just stay here with me. You mother's going to be gone for a while. But it's okay, because you have me." Quentin's father stammered while closing the front door. "Where's she going? Where's Mom?" Quentin asked, feeling suffocated by his father's embrace. "Don't worry about that right now, I need you to do me a favor. I want you to get your brother and tell him to take you over to the church. I will meet you both soon." Quentin's father closed the door to the house as he said this before finally releasing Quentin. "I have to get some cleaning done since your mother is gone, okay?" Quentin nodded and walked down to the river where he knew his brother often liked to go when wanting to avoid chores. His brother was only a few years older, but Quentin had since forgotten exactly how much, as it wasn't long after this memory that his brother disappeared too, and Quentin became adopted by the church. The memory got a bit lost here. He remembered going to the church with his brother, and then his brother leaving him before Quentin found himself alone in the great halls. Snapping out of it, Quentin focused on Rook as they approached Koldar. He reached down and placed his helmet back onto his head, at the same time tucking his cloak away. Here in the town he felt more confident in displaying where he was from. He didn't have many enemies here, as it was this town which guided him on the right path to the tower. Something he now felt he would be grateful for. He rode to the local inn and dismounted gracefully. He tried Rook to a post near the entrance of the inn. Worried about his newfound discovery, he hid his pack behind his shield once again. Most peasants walking by didn't seem to pay much attention to him. They were too busy carrying their goods or peddling their services. He could see that the wheat farmers were lined up at the mill, ready to pay for their harvest to be turned into grain. Grain which would help make one of the core building blocks of life. Quentin pushed his way into the inn, which was always crowded. This was the only place where the citizens could relax and enjoy themselves. It provided a distraction from those repetitive and monotonous tasks that engulfed the peasant class. For while this town had no lord living here, it was still a member of the Gordian Empire. While the Gordian Empire didn't rule as strictly as other kingdoms, it still collected tax. And from the looks of everyone in the inn, you either got away with paying very little, or you were trying to flush out the memory of making a heavy payment. Profit can be framed as a punishment depending on who you asked here. Ideally, you wanted to ensure you made enough money to survive without making enough money to rival anyone of the next class up. For if you did, you'd have to either find a way to maintain your income to join the class, or otherwise give you extra earnings over to them. The choice was always there, but proving a steady higher income was extremely difficult. So those with extra income would come here to the inn. The inn itself was very dark, and the wood holding the place up was in much need for repairs. While it was true that the owners of the inn could likely afford to hire carpenters to make the repairs, it was more profitable not to. The bleaker inside, the easier it was to try and swindle the tax collectors into thinking the business wasn't going very well. They were less likely to be subject to an economic investigation. Which was the nice way of saying, being robbed of all your coin. An economic investigation tended to only be used when one had more wealth than they ought to, as determined by the tax collectors. Their word was final, and to question them was treason. Town guards patrolling was allowed to make arrest upon the tax collector's request. So, Quentin enjoyed his long talks with the barkeep, as it helped him bond with the culture of the town. Before he had left for the tower, he knew that he would need somewhere safe to rest. It was now time for him to cash in on his reward, considering all the hard work he did for the barkeep to hold a room for him. "Ah, you're back. My goodness, I must be dreaming." The barkeep shouted excitedly. "Yes, I'm back, Tim. I am happy to be back too." Quentin tried to keep the same level of enthusiasm despite his exhaustion. "I honestly thought you were a dead man. Nobody goes to the dunes and comes back." Tim laughed harder as he had finally met someone who returned to him. "I'm quite the opposite of that, as you can see. Now take me to me room, I'm very exhausted." Quentin calmed himself as he tried to get to business. "I think that can most certainly be arranged. I'd rather lose a room to a bet than my hard-earned profits." Tim smiled and grabbed a key from behind the counter as he walked to the staircase. "Watch your step. Most people can't afford a room here, so I haven't had much reason to keep up with maintenance." Tim was a large man. His head could almost touch the ceiling, though part of that was due to his fluffy hat, which looked to be the only nice thing he owned. With his large bushy mustache dropping into his mouth, it was no wonder he spoke louder than most. Anything less might be interpreted as mumbling. It was obvious he had been working a long shift, as he smelled of leftover barley that you find when a tap was empty. Those barrels needed constant care to be reused. In fact, the whole atmosphere of the place was rather drab. The color on the walls had faded, and there were stains from likely past upset patrons. It didn't help that it certainly smelled like everyone had finished cleaning out the troughs in the sheep pen. The stairs were definitely unstable, as each time Tim took a lumbering step the wooden boards would creak. Almost similar to a dog having its tail stepped on, but it didn't realize until the pressure was being released. Not only was there a rough crushing sound from each step, but a low whine from removes the same step moments later. It wasn't until they reached the second story that the floor was given a break. The second floor was a simple narrow hallway with doors aligned on either side. Once the door to the room at the end of the hall swung open, all that it contained was a bed with the flattest mattress than the bedroll he packed himself, and a desk with a cupboard to store belongings. It wasn't much and made Quentin feel glad he didn't pay to stay here. If he had, it likely would have been overpriced and not even at a market value comparable to other inns. Tim nodded happily, feeling satisfied with the room he picked out for Quentin. Of course, Tim wasn't giving away that all the rooms were identical, and he only gave away the room at the end of the hall to minimize his new guest's need to bother him, not that a few feet would make a big difference. "Many thanks again, perhaps I'll win something else from you in the future," Quentin remarked as he sat down on the poor excuse for a bed. Tim chuckled, shaking his head as he was still surprised anyone could make it back, the evidence of this feat not going unnoticed. He left the room to allow his new guest to settle in. It wasn't going to be easy for Quentin to relax. He had been so used to being out in the wilderness, that the four walls around him felt somehow slightly alien. He grabbed onto the door handle and leaned against it, making sure the door was properly latched. Taking off the scabbard, he propped it against the door handle, to help secure it in place. Sometimes people get a bit rowdy when they have a long night of drinking, and tonight seemed to be no exception considering what he had witnessed down there. It wouldn't shock him to be woken in the middle of the night to the sounds of someone banging on his door because they got the rooms mixed up. The poor etchings into the center of each room with a number would make no difference in a drunk's stupidity. Quentin felt relieved as he was finally able to take off his armor. He rested his helmet on the table next to the bed. The tunic and chainmail took some time to remove, but he managed, making sure to carefully lay them out on the remainder of the table. He sighed slowly and kicked his pack under the cot to make himself feel better. In truth, it only made the pack harder to reach when he would need to leave in the morning. But that didn't matter right now, because he felt his head grow weary as he stretched out on the cot. His breath became the only noise he could hear. It was possible his sense of hearing was already shutting down to prepare to sleep, because he didn't hear the loud patrons down below. Or at least he was not acknowledging them anymore. But still, Quentin felt he couldn't sleep yet. He wanted to know more about what he had found. Leaning over the bed, Quentin reached down and grabbed the paper out from the spell book and glanced it over. The drawing was simple. It started at the base like a candlestick holder, the step working its way upward until it disappeared into a large diamond shape. To the best of his knowledge, the artifact looked like it might be some sort of a dagger or arrow. It didn't help that he had to make this picture without any colors at all. So being able to describe this thing was going to be a challenge. Not to mention he didn't know if the engraving in the altar was from the correct orientation to give the most accurate description. What if he was looking at the top or bottom of the artifact? Could he even make something relatable or recognizable appear in someone else's mind? Hard to say. The spell book itself was rather dusty and its pages were worn. Quentin was not familiar with magic and by no means even slightly worth of being called competent. But he felt that there had to be a protection spell of some sort in here. Because if there wasn't one, it would explain why the sprawl in the tower had been so quick. Surely the creature either didn't think to look for the spell or was arrogant enough to not think it needed it. Flipping through the pages, nothing caught his eye. It didn't help that he still felt the tight grip of sleep swirling around him. The room had grown surprisingly warm, almost as if you wanted to boil a frog, so you slowly increased the temperature. Right before he was ready to give up, he did find a spell that caught his eye. Quentin's head began to nod off as the grip on the book lessened. He carefully stuck the drawing of the artifact inside the spell book again and used it as a placeholder. It felt like slow motion as he watched the book fall to the ground. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to be vulnerable for this first time in almost a whole day/night cycle. His mind wandered as he kept thinking about the church. He couldn't remember how old he was, surely not more than 8, but he couldn't know. The priest who was attending the church stayed with Quentin as they both waited for his brother to come back. His brother never did return that night, and the priest allowed the young boy to stay in the church. While a cot was offered to the boy, it was declined. Insisting that Quentin's brother would come back, he decided to stay in the pews. It wasn't comfortable in the slightest, but he couldn't give up on his family. Father said he would join him and his brother as soon as he was done with the house. That house was the only thing Quentin had known his whole life, and wasn't even considering the possibility of never seeing that house again. And the pigs couldn't be left unattended, which to Quentin was a sign that he would have to leave the care of the church, as it would be wrong to leave them starve and their flesh be left to rot for the flies. What more could he hope for when a whole day had gone by and his brother nor his father arrived to get him and take him home? The priest sat next to Quentin and waited silently, watching the boy keep their eyes locked on the door. The priest even suggested that Quentin go out on his own. Quentin declined, of course, because that was not what his brother had told him to do. His brother always came back, and this was no different than any other situation in his mind. What good reason would there be for anything else to happen? So, he sat for another day, only drinking water and eating low-grade bread and cheese. A day turned into 2, which became a week. Weeks turned to months. Quentin felt his hope drain slowly like a poison as he stared at the church entrance. Every day he spent most of his time sat in a pew, fixed on the gap between the doors so he would see the moment they open and reveal his family to him. A year had gone by and the non-confrontational priest sat down next to Quentin, waiting patiently for even an acknowledgement, but it never came. The priest spent the whole day with the boy, and as the sun set, the priest felt it proper to speak. "Do you want me to take care of you? Until your family comes back. I know you reject my hospitality, but in God's eyes you are still his child. Thus, a child of this church, and it's my duty to care for all the church's children. Come eat with me, the church can provide you with sustenance." The priest stared at Quentin calmly and waited patiently. "Yes, sir, I think that would be all right." Quentin nodded and finally left his seat. Waking up in a cold sweat, Quentin gasped as he awoke to the smell of the inn below. The hops wafted upwards as the drinks were continually poured. The whole room was beginning to stink of the drinks, and Quentin wanted nothing to do with it. He sat up and began to dress himself. Today was going to be the start of a long journey back to his Lord. While his Lord was not a king, his Lord was in correspondence with the king of the Gordian Empire. This empire was the backbone of civilization, and though economic hardships were common, Quentin believed fulfilling his quest could help bring some good to this world. He secured his helm to his head and cleaned out the eye slits of any dust. His breathing echoing inside his helm. The colors of his nation clear as day, with the green holding him in high status as a servant of his Lord. Quentin grabbed the book which had fallen and opened it, sighing with relief as the paper was still intact. He couldn't afford to lose the drawing of the artifact. He swung his pack around him and fastened his sword to his waist. He felt as prepared as he ever could be as he marched towards the door. As the door swung open, as if on cue, Tim was standing there, recoiling as it looked like he had his ear to the door moments ago. "Oh, sorry son, just making sure you weren't dead, but I didn't want to call the doctors as they are both expensive and useless half the time. I won't charge you for the extra time if you could forgive my inquiry," Tim explained while cautiously staring at Quentin's sword. "Yes, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Now I must be off, long journey ahead. How's Rook doing, by the way? Sleep well?" Quentin asked as he lifted his shield and slung it around his back, before covering himself with his cloak. "Oh, she is just fine, sir. I took the liberty of giving her food and water, as I value you so much as a customer," Tim said, not raising his eyes yet. Quentin nodded and walked past Tim. The loud thud of his boots clanking down the hall, then down the stairs, and finally out the door. Quentin took the liberty of snagging some bread and pouches of water from behind the bar. Not like anyone wasted their money on things other than alcohol anyways. Tim nervously watched without protesting, and waited until he could hear the door of the inn shut before sighing in relief that the well-armed man didn't rob him right there. Rook was standing ready to go as she snorted at seeing Quentin return. He lifted himself onto Rook's back and pulled the reins back to his control, rather than the building. Onlookers who were passing by couldn't help but stare at the armor. It was cleaner than anything else in the whole town. Quentin turned Rook in the correct direction back to his lord and started them on their return trip home once again.